Hey guys, welcome back to The Last Hike. Today I'm going over what happened in Yosemite this year, and it's by far the deadliest year on record. I'll be covering 5 different deaths, each one with a completely different cause. Together they paint a picture of just how dangerous this mountain really is, and just how stupid people can be. It was the 8th of April, 2026 in Yosemite National Park, California. The morning at Glacier Point was clear with light winds and long visibility across Yosemite Valley and surrounding granite formations. By late afternoon, the overlook was crowded, with visitors moving between marked viewpoints and unprotected granite edges dropping into steep cliffs without barriers or railings. Elvis Amore, age 24, was a recent business school graduate from Dallas, Texas. He was traveling through western United States national parks on a post-graduation road trip that had been planned over several months. The trip was structured around stops intended for personal documentation and social media content. He was physically fit and comfortable with long-distance walking, but had limited experience in high-elevation environments where terrain changes, slope, and edge exposure are not always visually obvious. At Glacier Point, he carried a phone-mounted recording device and moved between multiple vantage points along the overlook. His activity consisted primarily of filming short clips, adjusting framing, and reviewing recorded footage. Over time, he kind of drifted away from the main viewing spots and ended up in these quieter patches of granite closer to the edge. The ground there still looked flat at first glance, but it actually had these small, subtle slopes that slowly pulled you toward the rim without you really noticing a clear point where it changed. As the afternoon progressed, he began recording a sequence while walking backward and filming himself. The movement required continuous attention to the screen while stepping without visual confirmation of the terrain behind him. He maintained a steady pace, periodically checking the device to adjust framing and positioning. His path crossed onto a section of granite, where the slope subtly increased toward the overlook edge, reducing natural braking from friction and foot placement. He continued moving backward across this sloped surface. At several points, minor adjustments in footing were required to maintain balance, particularly as the terrain transitioned from flatter granite to slightly rounded rock. These changes were not marked or clearly distinguishable from surrounding surfaces, and there were no physical barriers indicating proximity to the edge. I'll be honest, watching someone drift that close to the rim without really looking up from the screen never really feels dramatic in the moment. It just looks like someone lining up another take. Near the rim, he stepped onto a smoother, slightly convex section of granite. At the same time, his attention remained directed toward the recording device. Investigators later noted that his final steps occurred without direct visual confirmation of the ground behind him. He took another backward step that placed his foot near the edge of the stable surface. The combination of slope, reduced friction, and rearward movement resulted in a shift in balance that could not be corrected within the available space. His center of gravity moved beyond the edge line of the overlook. Once that occurred, there was no remaining stable surface behind him to recover footing. He fell backward over the edge of Glacier Point. The transition from standing to falling occurred in a short time frame, consistent with a loss of balance near an unprotected drop-off rather than a prolonged descent or attempt to climb or stop the movement. It doesn't look like anything dramatic from the outside, just a step that doesn't land right. After he went over the edge, he basically hit the cliff face right away. The first impacts were against uneven rock just below the rim, and then he kept dropping down along different vertical sections of exposed granite. It didn't really stop or slow in any meaningful way until he eventually reached the lower talus slopes at the base of the cliff system. Visitors in the area observed the movement and reported it immediately after recognizing what had occurred. Some accounts described a brief delay between the loss of footing and realization that a fall had taken place, consistent with the short duration of the event. Emergency services were contacted within minutes, and park response teams were dispatched shortly afterward. Due to the steep terrain and limited access routes beneath Glacier Point, recovery operations required both ground-based search teams and aerial support. The area of impact was not visible from the overlook, and locating the exact position required coordination between multiple units. Operations continued into the following day before personnel reached and secured the location. The official medical examination determined that death resulted from multiple blunt force injuries consistent with a high elevation fall. Investigators found no evidence of foul play, structural failure, or equipment malfunction. The incident was classified as an accidental fall from an unprotected cliff edge. Contributing factors included loss of footing on sloped granite and reduced situational awareness while the subject's attention was directed toward a handheld recording device during movement near the edge. It was the 25th of April, 2026. The half-dome cable route was open under a spring weather window after winter conditions had receded. The morning was mild, but stronger upper-level winds signaled changing conditions across the exposed granite dome. Melvin Dimple, age 31, a sales manager from Phoenix, Arizona, had planned the half-dome climb as the defining goal of his trip. He had experience with long desert hikes and endurance-based outdoor activity, but limited exposure to steep alpine routes reliant on fixed steel cables and narrow wooden boards on near-vertical granite. The permit was secured months in advance, and he treated the ascent as a personal benchmark he intended to complete regardless of conditions. People often arrive with a finish-it-no-matter-what mindset, but Half Dome doesn't respond to determination or intent. I've seen that attitude run into problems up there more than once. He started early and moved steadily through forested trail sections and granite approach slopes without difficulty as the terrain shifted from defined path to exposed rock and then into the steep chute leading toward the cable section. By the time he reached the base, congestion had already formed, with hikers stacked in uneven intervals as groups paused before entering the steepest part of the route. The cable section slowed immediately. Wooden planks dictated footing, but hikers ahead frequently paused mid-climb, forcing those below to hold position on steep granite while gripping the cables. As Melvin moved into the midsection, spacing tightened further as hesitation at board transitions created delays that rippled down the line. The granite beneath the route, worn smooth by heavy use, offered limited traction when unweighted, increasing strain during each pause. By late morning, cloud cover thickened across surrounding ridges, shifting light across the dome in alternating bands of brightness and shadow, while wind moved intermittently across the exposed face. Despite the changing conditions, movement remained compressed into short, uneven bursts as progress continued. Melvin maintained controlled descent, alternating between gripping the cable and stepping carefully between boards. However, the structure of the route required repeated transitions, where full footing briefly replaced cable support. These moments became more critical as congestion forced longer pauses, leaving hikers standing on steep granite without forward motion for extended periods. There's a fatigue that builds up quietly on that climb, not from distance, but from never really getting to relax your grip. By early afternoon, light precipitation began to fall. It started as fine droplets that spread quickly across the exposed rock surface. The granite, already polished by heavy use, changed character as moisture reduced friction. Wet patches formed unevenly, particularly on sloped sections between wooden boards where runoff collected in thin films. The thing about the cable section is that it stops being a trail and starts being a queue on a slope. People don't really think of it that way until everything slows down. Witnesses later described a sudden loss of stability rather than a clear, directional slip. His feet gave way almost simultaneously, and his body dropped relative to the cable line. He tried to recover by pulling against the steel support, managing only a brief moment of resistance as his lower body swung outward along the steep slope. The combination of wet granite and sharp incline quickly overwhelmed his grip. His hands detached from the cable shortly after, removing his only remaining point of support. Once separated, his descent became fully uncontrolled. He entered a sliding fall along exposed granite beside the cable route, accelerating as the slope steepened. The motion was uneven and repeatedly disrupted by rock outcrops that altered his trajectory and increased the severity of impacts. The slide continued across multiple granite sections before gradually transitioning toward a lower area where the incline began to reduce. Hikers above and below attempted to alert others and move toward the incident site, but congestion along the cable route prevented immediate coordinated response. Many remained fixed in place due to lack of passing space, while others hesitated to enter the wet upper section where footing had become unreliable. Emergency services were notified quickly, but access was delayed by both weather and the technical difficulty of the route. Rangers and rescue personnel waited for conditions to improve before ascending the cables and adjacent rock routes to reach the fall zone. Melvin was pronounced dead at the scene due to multiple blunt force injuries consistent with a high-energy fall and repeated impacts along a steep granite surface. The investigation concluded that wet granite conditions, congestion along the cable route, and loss of traction during a transition between fixed board sections were primary contributing factors. no evidence of equipment failure or medical emergency was identified. It was the 4th of May 2026. The morning at Vernal Fall was cool at around 63 degrees Fahrenheit, with steady foot traffic along the mist trail. Snowmelt had raised river levels, and shaded sections of trail remained damp, leaving soil and rock darker and less stable than sunlit areas. Andrew Foster, age 27, worked as a delivery supervisor in Sacramento, California. He had limited hiking experience beyond regional parks and preferred direct, time-efficient routes over longer switchbacks or crowded paths. On a short visit to Yosemite, he aimed to see multiple landmarks in a single day, treating the trail as a sequence of timed stops rather than a continuous hike. The mist trail always moves slower than people expect once the crowds stack up near the falls. It turns into a place where patience matters more than pace, even if nobody really plans for that going in. He began the ascent steadily, but congestion quickly formed as the trail narrowed near the waterfall approach. Groups moved slowly through tight switchbacks, creating repeated pauses that reduced overall progress. As delays increased, Andrew began scanning the hillside for alternative paths that cut away from the main route. Along the slope, faint dirt lines were visible through the vegetation informal use trails that lacked reinforcement or maintenance. Andrew chose one, expecting it to reconnect with the main switchbacks further ahead. I've seen plenty of hikers take that shortcut decision when the main trail feels like it's stalling, and honestly, it doesn't usually end well. At first, the ground held relatively well. The slope was steep, but passable, and the soil remained compact enough for steady footing. However, as he moved farther from the main trail, conditions gradually worsened, vegetation thinned, roots became exposed, and the soil loosened under each step, with small stones shifting and rolling downslope. The distance from other hikers increased as voices faded, replaced by the constant sound of Vernal Fall below. The informal path became less defined, blending into erosion lines that were harder to distinguish from natural terrain. Despite the worsening conditions, Andrew continued forward across uneven ground with inconsistent support. As the slope steepened, movement required more deliberate placement of each step. In several areas, the hillside showed signs of prior disturbance, minor slides, exposed roots, and patches where vegetation had failed to reestablish. These indicators suggested instability beneath the visible surface, though the ground still appeared continuous at a glance. He eventually reached a section where the vegetation line broke abruptly, forming a shallow depression in the slope. Investigators later identified this area as one where water runoff had gradually undermined the upper soil layer, leaving a thin crust of surface material unsupported beneath. The change was subtle in appearance, but significant in structure. That kind of slope doesn't feel different until the weight actually goes through it. As Andrew stepped onto this section, the surface failed without warning. The collapse was localized but immediate, removing support beneath his leading foot and shifting his balance downhill. His attempt to stabilize was interrupted by the steep angle and the loose composition of the surrounding soil, which began to break apart under load. Within seconds, he transitioned from controlled movement to a full downhill slide. The descent accelerated as the slope increased and vegetation thinned. The ground beneath him fragmented into a mix of soil, small rocks, and exposed roots, none of which provided meaningful resistance. Each attempt to slow himself only redirected his path further downslope. During the slide, he struck several trees and embedded rocks along the hillside. These impacts altered his trajectory repeatedly, causing brief deflections that increased force rather than stopping the descent. Sections of brush provided momentary resistance but quickly gave way under momentum. As he continued downward, the terrain transitioned from soil-covered slope to a more exposed granite band. The change in surface created a sudden shift in motion, redirecting his path across the rock face. The impact against this section caused a sharp change in direction, sending him toward a final drop beyond the edge of the intermediate ledge system. From that point, he fell approximately 250 feet to a lower rocky area. The descent ended in a scattered impact zone, composed of broken stone and uneven terrain below the main hiking corridor. Hikers on the maintained mist trail reported hearing repeated impacts coming from below the slope and alerted park personnel. The sounds were initially unclear in origin due to the waterfall noise, but the pattern of impacts prompted concern among nearby groups. Rangers were notified shortly afterward and initiated a coordinated response. Search and recovery efforts began once conditions allowed safe access to the off-trail slope. Due to the steepness of the terrain and dense vegetation, ground teams had to approach from a lower access point before ascending toward the reported location. Andrew was located later that afternoon in a section of terrain well below the established trail system. The medical examiner determined that death resulted from multiple blunt force injuries sustained during a high-energy fall and repeated impacts along a steep hillside. Investigators concluded that leaving the maintained trail and entering an unstable, eroded slope directly contributed to the collapse and subsequent descent. It was the 11th of May, 2026. The Upper Yosemite Falls Trail was fully exposed to late spring heat, with temperatures exceeding 90 degrees Fahrenheit and long, unshaded stretches across steep terrain of packed dirt, loose rock, and eroded granite steps. Heat built steadily across the exposed sections, with minimal cover available as the trail climbed through open rock faces and sun-baked switchbacks. Pines Beldad, age 34, an IT consultant from Las Vegas, Nevada, had experience with desert hiking and heat exposure, but limited familiarity with sustained elevation gain in mountainous terrain. Confident in his conditioning, he carried a reduced water supply, prioritizing pace over extended hydration planning. He began the ascent early, moving steadily through the cooler morning hours with a consistent rhythm as the trail steepened. In the lower sections, he passed hikers who paused frequently, while he continued upward with minimal stops. As elevation increased, direct sun exposure intensified and reflective granite amplified heat across exposed stretches. Water use increased steadily throughout the climb. Long, unshaded sections, limited recovery time, and exertion accumulated gradually rather than in clear breaks. By the time he reached higher elevations, his remaining water supply was significantly reduced. I've seen that pattern before. Strong start, then the water situation catches up quietly in the background. It never feels urgent until suddenly it is. At several upper viewpoints, he paused for extended rest and photography. These stops were longer than earlier breaks and pushed his descent into the hottest part of the day when temperature and trail exposure peaked. As he began the descent, conditions had clearly worsened. The already uneven trail became more demanding under fatigue, with slower downhill movement on loose stone and irregular granite steps. Observers later noted increased caution, longer pauses, and occasional reliance on more stable inner trail edges where footing was firmer. Dehydration and heat exposure began to compound. His movement became less consistent, with minor hesitations before stepping down uneven sections and occasional stumbles that required brief recovery before continuing. While he remained on the maintained trail, his stability appeared reduced compared to the earlier climb. Downhill in that condition isn't really easier. It just exposes everything that's been building up on the way up. As he descended further, he entered a narrower section of trail, bordered by loose rock on one side and a steep drop into a drainage channel on the other. The path here was constrained, forcing hikers into single-file movement with limited space to pass. Several hikers were moving more slowly ahead, creating intermittent pauses along the descent line. He stepped slightly aside to allow others to pass. The ground at the edge of the trail consisted of loose, fragmented rock and thin soil over hard granite. Under load, the material lacked cohesion. As his foot shifted onto this outer edge, the surface began to give way almost immediately. The loss of support was sudden. His foot slipped laterally as the edge collapsed, and his body shifted off balance toward the downhill side of the slope. He attempted to correct his position, but the combination of fatigue, steep angle, and unstable footing prevented recovery. He fell off the maintained trail and transitioned into a sliding descent down a steep, rocky drainage slope below the path. The initial slide accelerated quickly as loose soil and rock fragments broke away beneath him, removing any remaining resistance. His trajectory carried him diagonally across the slope, with increasing speed as the terrain steepened. During the descent, he struck multiple fixed objects, including embedded rocks and exposed outcrops, each impact altering his direction but not stopping the fall. The slope funneled him toward a drainage channel, where larger boulders and irregular rock formations created a more confined path. Once someone drops into a drainage like that, the terrain takes over completely. There's no real control left at that point. He entered the channel at speed, continuing to collide with uneven rock surfaces. The terrain in this section was composed of large, fixed boulders and debris from previous erosion events, which contributed to repeated high-force impacts. The motion only ceased after he reached a lower section of the drainage area, below the main trail, and out of sight from hikers above. Other hikers reported hearing or observing movement off-trail and alerted park personnel. Some witnesses initially mistook the sound of impacts for falling debris until they observed movement below the trail line and recognized a human fall. Rangers were notified shortly afterward and initiated a response, but access was delayed due to steep terrain and the need to approach from a lower access route. Recovery teams reached the location later that day after coordinating access through the drainage system and adjacent slopes. Pines was located in a lower rocky section of the channel, separated from the main trail corridor. The medical examiner determined that death resulted from multiple blunt force injuries sustained during a high-energy fall with repeated impacts along a steep drainage slope. Investigators concluded that dehydration, fatigue, and loss of footing on unstable trail edge material directly contributed to the incident, compounded by the steep terrain and loose surface conditions of the descent path. It was the 21st of May, 2026. The Taft Point overlook was dry and clear with steady visitor traffic across open granite near the rim, overlooking a steep, unprotected drop of several hundred feet. The exposed surface stretched wide and uninterrupted, with visitors naturally spreading out along the edge to take in the valley views. I've been to Taft Point in similar conditions. It always feels calm right up until you remember how unprotected the edge actually is. That kind of openness messes with depth perception more than people expect. Cisco Pulitzy, age 38, a high school science teacher from Fresno, California, was an experienced but self-directed backpacker who often organized short wilderness trips. He was used to moderate loads on uneven terrain, but for this hike, he carried a heavier pack than usual, including camera equipment and additional supplies added shortly before departure. The load was functional but unevenly distributed due to items stored in outer compartments. He began the hike at a steady pace, making small adjustments to the pack as the weight shifted with elevation. These adjustments were minor at first and did not affect his stability. As the route opened into exposed granite near Taft Point, movement became less structured and small balance shifts became more noticeable. By the time he reached the overlook, visitor density had increased. Groups moved between informal viewing positions near the rim, often pausing to take photos of the valley below. Cisco joined them, spending extended time near the edge while framing shots and adjusting his stance to compensate for the pack's uneven feel. I've seen plenty of hikers do this part almost on autopilot, camera up, feet adjusting without real awareness of how close they are to getting to the rim. Observers later noted repeated minor strap adjustments and subtle weight shifts from side to side. The backpack responded with slight lateral sway during forward lean or rotation, indicating a persistent imbalance that required constant correction. As he moved closer to the rim to improve his camera angle, he stepped into a narrower section of exposed granite where footing required more deliberate placement. At the same time, he adjusted or accessed equipment stored on the outside of his backpack, briefly shifting how the load rested across his shoulders. This did not meaningfully alter his overall balance on its own. However, it occurred during a moment where he was already leaning forward and rotating his torso for a shot, which reduced his stability margin near the edge. He made a small corrective adjustment to recenter his posture while standing near the edge. That movement required precise footing on smooth granite, where traction can vary depending on angle and pressure. At the same time, his available space for a recovery step behind him was limited by his proximity to the rim, reducing how much he could safely shift backward. With his feet already positioned close to the edge of the overlook, there was limited usable space behind him to naturally step back into stability. Instead of a full recovery step, the movement became more of a partial shift in weight, where his upper body moved faster than his feet could properly re-anchor. During that adjustment, his balance shifted into a position that was difficult to recover from given the limited space available behind him. With little room to step back and re-establish footing, his ability to correct the movement was significantly reduced. At that point, further adjustments were no longer sufficient to regain stable balance in time. Witnesses nearby described the motion as a sudden backward loss of balance rather than a controlled step or push. Because of his proximity to the edge, there was insufficient time for nearby visitors to react or close the distance before he passed the rim. He dropped several hundred feet down the vertical face of Taft Point. The descent involved multiple impacts against protruding rock surfaces and ledges along the cliff wall, with his trajectory changing repeatedly before continuing into lower sections of exposed granite and talus near the base. I've seen enough of these cliffside recoveries to know the fall itself is only part of the problem. The terrain does most of the work afterward. Emergency calls were placed within minutes by visitors in the area who had witnessed the fall. Some initially hesitated, confirming what they had seen due to the speed of the event and the difficulty of tracking movement over the cliff edge. Park personnel and search and rescue teams were dispatched shortly afterward, initiating a technical response due to the steep and inaccessible terrain below the overlook. Recovery operations required rope systems and coordinated descent from a safer access point, as direct approach from above was not possible. Conditions along the cliff face, including loose rock and uneven ledges, slowed progress for responders. Cisco was located later in a lower section of the cliff environment, well below the primary viewing area. The medical examiner determined that death resulted from multiple blunt force injuries sustained during the fall and repeated impacts against the rock face. Investigators found no evidence of foul play, structural failure, or environmental collapse at the overlook. The official conclusion noted that a combination of factors, including proximity to the cliff edge, body positioning during photography, and load management of carried equipment, contributed to the loss of balance and fall. No structural or environmental failures were identified at the overlook,